Oh, the other thing, I'm going to mute all except for Michael. Okay, so I'm muting you all. I think I am. Oh, go ahead and mute your microphone if you could. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Yeah.
Okay, so
Okay.
everyone else, please mute your microphones now. All right, I'm just checking to make sure that happens. Not everybody's muted. I'm going to go ahead and do it. Let me get you, Michael, up. Michael, unmute yours, but I want everybody else to remain muted. Are you there, Michael?
Right. Yes,
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You go ahead. All right.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Tom. And as those who've been before will remember that we've been talking about inculturation and its importance, and particularly the scope of inculturation and the role of dialogue in inculturation, what kinds of dialogues there are, and its importance in the process of inculturation. So I come now to a specific question that often arises in the context of mission and dialogue, which is about what term Christians should use for God. The problem is already found in the Bible. The Hebrew term El can be used for the gods of the nations, and even, it seems, for godlike humans, and yet can also be used with the Hebrew article Ha for the only and true God, even alongside the divine tetragrammaton, the unpronounceable name of God. So in Psalm 18, Isaiah 42, etc. Melchizedek, you can see him over there, is described as priest of El Elyon, or God Most High, in Genesis 14. He blesses the name of God Most High and blesses Abram, as he then was, in the name of God Most High. Abram then offers him a tithe of all he has. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Older Testament, which was the Bible, of course, of the early church, ho theos is used for ha el, or for ha Elohim, in the full knowledge that the term could be and was used for pagan gods, and indeed in variant forms for goddesses. This usage of referring to the God of the Bible as theos, with or without the article, continues in the New Testament, Matthew 1:23, John 1:18, and many other places. The same can be said of the Aramaic Syriac Allaha and of the Latin Deus. They can both refer to the true God and to the diverse deities of the Levantine or the Greco-Roman paganism. Coming to the modern missionary movement, William Carey is celebrated for initiating a deep study of classical Indian literature, including religious literature. His purpose in doing so was, of course, to discover appropriate terminology in which to communicate the gospel to Hindus. He revised his translation of the Bible into Bengali several times, in the patience that was required for that. In doing so, he had to choose which word for God to use. Because his orientation was towards Hinduism and Sanskrit, he chose Ishwar, a term used to refer to the supreme being in Hinduism, thought of in personal terms. This use certainly reached Hindu Bengalis, but it gave Muslim Bengalis the impression that Christianity was some kind of Hindu sect, an impression that was not corrected until a version of the New Testament was produced late in the 20th century using Muslim terminology. I remember being in Zimbabwe as the preacher on the occasion of the centenary of Bernard Mizeki's martyrdom. This Mozambican apostle to the Shona people was most interested in discovering the spiritual vocabulary. I think I'd stay with Mizeki if I were you, Tom.
Okay, yeah, here we go. There we go.
So Mizeki was most interested in discovering the spiritual vocabulary of the people that he was reaching, and in particular about their belief in the Great Spirit, or Mwari, M-W-A-R-I. It was illuminating, therefore, to see how this has become the ordinary word for God amongst Christians in Zimbabwe, and is thus regularly used in the liturgy. The East African scholar John Beattie has shown how belief in a supreme being is ubiquitous in pre-modern Africa, and the great Ghanaian missiologist Kwame Bediako, whom of course people at OCMS know very well, tells us that in virtually every Christian community in Africa, the Christian term for God is usually the pre-Christian name for the supreme being. This brings us to the hotly contested topic of the use of Allah by Christians and the relation of the God of the Quran to the God of the Bible. It is clear that the term Allah was already in use amongst Arabs in pre-Islamic Arabia. It has been suggested that it is a loan word adapted from the Christian Aramaic Allah, or that it emerged when the different tribes came together for pilgrimage, and the God of each, Al-Ilah, the God, came to be seen as the common deity of all. This is known sometimes as the Amphictyony theory. There is, however, another possibility. John Beattie has shown that in primal traditions, the name for the supreme being is often older than the name for lesser divinities, spirits, ancestors, etc., and can be shared amongst what are now diverse cultures and languages. If this is applied to pre-Islamic Arabia, it raises the possibility that the term Allah is not an import, nor is it a development out of the tribes coming together, but that it may be, as in Africa, it may belong to a primal monotheism, which was later corrupted into polytheism. Whatever we may say of the prehistory, it cannot be denied that Allah came to the fore in the Quran as the deity which reveals himself to Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. The Quranic doctrine of God is quite different from the biblical and the Christian. Now, I think I stay with the Arabs at the moment. Okay. Yeah. Here is a God who is utterly transcendent and who cannot be known. Only what he reveals of his will, his commands and prohibitions can be known and must be obeyed. In spite of some ambiguities in the tradition, his unity is thought of as numerical rather than relational, and the Christian doctrine of the Trinity as well as the divinity of Christ are explicitly denied. So those who assert that the doctrine of Allah in the Quran and the biblical view of God are incompatible have a strong case. In the light of these significant differences, should Christians use the term Allah for God? We know that Christians writing in Arabic were using this term from the earliest period, and the translations of the Bible into Arabic, again from the earliest to our own times, use this term for God. This is also true of liturgy, preaching, apologetics, prayer, and devotion. What needs saying is that Arabic-speaking Christians do not use the word in its Islamic sense. As with all other languages and their terms for the supreme being, they infuse it with a biblical and Christian sense, which is quite distinct from its Quranic meaning. My own experience of those who come to faith in Christ from a Muslim background is that they often see their experience of God while still Muslims, however ill-defined and even distorted, as preparing them for the good news of the gospel. They can see it as completion, correction, even transformation. But there is not usually total rejection of what has gone before. As the well-known late bishop in Iran, Bishop Hassan Dakhani Tafti, himself a convert, states, I quote, "Some people tend to think that Muslims have one God and Christians another. While I agree that the two concepts are very different indeed from each other, I cannot agree that they really worship two utterly different gods. I never had a complete brainwash, as it were, of my past faith in God, neither did I think it was necessary to do so. It was when I really put my trust in God that I started to study and experience the different conceptions of him in the two religions. End of quote. Bishop Kenneth Cragg, who was for long the doyen of Christian scholarship on Islam, similarly recognizes that there are very significant differences between Christian and Muslim accounts of God. But he claims there are similarities and continuities as well. Christians and Muslims may together affirm some of God's attributes, such as his omnipotence, omniscience, and mercy, while disagreeing about others, such as suffering, humility, and incarnation. Cragg believes that in grammatical terms, this is disagreement about the predicates of the same subject. On the other hand, Arne Rudwin, the late Bishop of Karachi, held that the way in which Christians understand the nature and attributes of God is so radically different from Islam that we cannot easily think that we are speaking of the same being. Even with supposedly shared beliefs about the unity of God, prophecy, or revelation, the ways in which these are understood are so different in Islam and Christianity that the similarity is more verbal than real. When Muslims talk about God, however, it is not always with Islamic doctrine in mind, but in terms of what Christians would call general revelation in creation and conscience. It is interesting to note that many languages spoken by Muslims retain words for God other than Allah. Khuda, for instance, is an obvious example. In this sense, certainly, however incomplete or distorted such an understanding may be from a Christian point of view, it is possible to converse and even to witness on the basis that we are talking about the supreme being, the maker of heaven and earth and of ourselves, the one who has implanted a knowledge of his will in human hearts, however much fallen humans have obscured and distorted it. In some patristic, Reformed, and Catholic thought, there is also the notion of prisca theologia, that is to say, a certain amount of God's special revelation to the ancients has been preserved in all cultures and even religious traditions. This can work as preparatio evangelica, which enables a response to Christian evangelism when it does take place. Whilst always being alert to the corruption of whatever knowledge of God people may have, the above discussion gives us some grounds for recognizing a certain amount of commonality and continuity in dialogue with partners of other faiths and of none, and in bearing faithful witness to them. So this is part of what you might call discursive dialogue, where we discuss matters of belief with people, share our beliefs, and listen to their accounts of their beliefs. But there are other kinds of dialogue. There is also the dialogue of the heart, where people share their spiritual experience with one another. It is well known that the Prophet of Islam was very taken with the Christian monks and hermits of the Egyptian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian deserts. Thus, the Quran declares that Christians are the nearest to Muslims in love. And this is because they have among them monks and priests, and they are not arrogant. Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, verse 85. Even Muslim scholars allow that the pioneers of Sufism or Islamic mysticism were influenced by the example of Christian monasticism, even if later on Neoplatonic, Hindu, and Buddhist influence cannot be discounted. There has also been significant and more recent dialogue of this kind between Christians and Hindus and Christians and Buddhists. With Hindus, names like the Benedictine Bede Griffiths with his Christian ashram movement, and Swami Abhishektananda, also a Benedictine, come to mind. The latter has written of the encounter of the heart, where Hindus and Christians can ponder together the deepest mysteries. For Christians, these are revealed in the face of Jesus Christ, whereas for Hindus, they have as yet no face, according to the Swami. The encounter of the American Cistercian monk Thomas Merton with the Buddhist mystical tradition is well known. His concern was whether traditions other than Christian can question or even illuminate the Christian spiritual quest. There are obviously dangers in these approaches of syncretism and compromise, but there cannot be true contextualization if the deepest spiritual longings and resources of people are not taken into account. An Anglican example of such encounter with the Hindu and Buddhist traditions can be found in the letters between Max Warren, General Secretary of the Church Mission Society in the middle years of the 20th century, and his son-in-law Roger Hooker, who along with Warren's daughter Pat, was a CMS mission partner in the Hindu holy city of Varanasi, or Benares, as it was then known. Although the letters range far and wide on questions of interfaith encounter in general, they also manifest a deep awareness of the need for a spiritual encounter between believers from different traditions and how an encounter with Christ might transform the spirituality of India from the inside. All of this goes well beyond inculturation of external forms and even of language. It seeks to express the Christian faith in terms of the spiritual awareness and even insights of another tradition and culture, and most importantly, in response to its deepest longings. In terms of the Anglican tradition, we find that the stated aim of the Anglican reformers was to reconnect the promises of the gospel with the desires found in the deepness of the human heart and transform them thereby. This is also, I believe, what missiologists like John Taylor, Max Warren, and Roger Hooker are trying to express in their dealings with the diverse spiritual heritage of the human race. Another reason for dialogue is the need to build up peaceful communities with a commitment to harmonious coexistence and cooperation in the development of such communities. There are many examples that you and I will know of such cooperation. I well remember a Muslim sheikh and his Christian friend telling us in Kenya how the two communities help each other, not just in self-help projects, but even at the level of families interacting with one another. I know that the term Harambe has become controversial. The concept has been misused to some extent, and some Christians have reservations about it because of its connections with a Hindu god. Nevertheless, it shouldn't distract us from the kind of cooperation that was possible in Kenya and with Ujamaa in Tanzania between people of different faiths in building a common home. Such cooperation can lead to dialogue about the well springs of belief in each community which lead to such cooperation, as well as to an acknowledgement of distinctives. In Pakistan, similarly, the Franciscans established a center in an ordinary flat on a large housing estate in the city of Karachi. The center was open to all. Free coaching was offered to school children, and there was a place for prayer and meditation. Questions about human rights, justice, and freedom began to be raised, and these in turn led to a dialogue about the spiritual basis for our commitments to these personal and social goods. The Anglican diocese in Egypt, pictured here, runs some schools and healthcare programs along with Muslim partners. According to them, this has increased social harmony and created a basis for dialogue about matters of faith. Many other examples can be given regarding cooperation and dialogue for the sake of cohesion and development. More recently, with the resurgence of religious extremism of different kinds, there's been a desire for people of different faiths to discuss the nature of fundamental human freedoms, what their faiths teach about them, and their own commitment in this matter. On some occasions, this discussion has taken place around the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and especially Article 18, which guarantees freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, the right to change one's religion and to manifest this religion in public or in private. Where Roman Catholics have been involved, the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, has also featured as a basis for such dialogue. As Colin Chapman has noted, a number of attempts have been made at articulating declarations of human rights for the Islamic world, but they've been notable for the absence of an equivalent to Article 18 of the UN Declaration. I have myself been involved in dialogues regarding fundamental freedoms with varying results. In the dialogue with Al-Azhar al-Sharif in Cairo, the premier place of Sunni learning in the world, the need for freedom of belief in the UN Article 18 sense came increasingly to be recognized on both sides. This has been a welcome development and now needs to be acknowledged in terms of law and practice in Egypt and beyond. And the recent developments in the Sudan need to be noted with the repeal of the apostasy law there. With Shia scholars in Iran, there has been much less success. While they are willing to accept that there should be freedom of religion for the country's religio-ethnic minorities, there is significant resistance to any recognition of the right of people to change their religion except where they convert to Islam. Government-sponsored dialogues like the US Secretary of State's ministerials are also engaging with questions of religious freedom. This kind of dialogue will become more and more important as minorities from many religious groups are threatened by religious or nationalist extremism. We see then that dialogue is necessary for effective missionary engagement with cultures and the worldview that underlies them. Not only does this help Christians to develop a proper awareness of the language, thought forms, attitudes of reverence, and many other features of the cultures in the midst of which they are placed, but it should be our hope that it also helps people in the culture concerned to find its true center and to lead to that fulfillment which they desire for themselves. At a more personal level, dialogue can be about the sharing of our deepest experiences and spiritual aspirations. And it can also be about building community, about protecting fundamental freedoms, including freedom of belief. Above all, it is for the sake of communicating the good news of Jesus Christ and for the planting of Christian communities familiar with the spiritual and cultural idiom of the people they are seeking to reach and among whom they are placed. Now, the question is, if this is the scope of inculturation, what, if any, are the limits to such a process? And these questions have always existed. In Article 34 of the 39 Articles of Religion of the Church of England, gospel accommodation to local culture is limited with the significant caveat so that nothing be ordained against God's work. So people can adapt to local cultures, languages, and so on, as long as nothing is ordained against God's word, according to Article 34. What then is authentically a conveying of the good news in terms which people can understand and accept, and what is compromise or even capitulation? When the Council of Jerusalem decreed in around 50 AD that Gentile converts to Christian faith were not required to become Jews as a condition of becoming Christian, it laid down some minimal criteria about refraining from idolatry and immorality for these converts. It also required them not to eat certain things so that table fellowship between Jews and Gentiles could be possible. It goes without saying, however, that many other matters about worship of the one God of the Jewish scriptures, the rejection of the imperial cult, the primacy of confessing Jesus as Lord, and a readiness to receive the Holy Spirit would all have been assumed. We have seen already the tension between those missionaries in Europe who wished to accommodate some aspects of pagan culture and those who were adamantly opposed. Thus, Gregory the Great's famous letter directed to St. Augustine of Canterbury instructs him to retain the pagan shrines and after purification put them to Christian use. St. Boniface, the English missionary to the Germans, on the other hand, was assiduous in destroying sacred trees and pagan shrines. Even Gregory's letter provides for inculturation with certain restrictions to guard against syncretism. Are there then limits to inculturation or criteria by which authentic inculturation can be distinguished from mere accommodation? In his landmark encyclical on the continuing missionary mandate of the Church Redemptoris Missio, Pope John Paul II encourages the process of inculturation. In this process, the Church makes the gospel meaningfully present in different cultures and also welcomes people with their cultures and customs into her own community. She transmits gospel values to them while at the same time taking good elements from these cultures and renewing them from within so that the gospel can be better understood and lived in those cultures. According to him, there are, however, limits to this process. Whatever is done must be compatible with the nature of the gospel itself, and secondly, it should not hinder fellowship among churches and Christians in widely differing situations. If the gospel is taken to be the whole of God's plan for his creation, this must mean that inculturation does not detract in any way from the narratives of creation, fall, redemption, election in Christ, sanctification, and glorification. At the same time, our inculturation into our culture should be recognizable as authentically evangelical by other churches and Christians, just as theirs should be recognizable to us. Truly inculturated expressions of the gospel in various cultures will eventually be seen to be in harmony with one another, even if there are tensions and questions along the way. This is one of the reasons, of course, for what the creeds call the Catholic Church, a worldwide and across the ages fellowship of Christians and churches where there is mutual discernment of the truth about aspects of Christian belief or of living the Christian life, the possibility of mutual correction and complementarity, and some agreement about how the gospel can be proclaimed both distinctively and unitedly in diverse cultures. In our day, the challenge for the Anglican Communion in this respect is to renounce the idea of the radical autonomy of local churches, which has been foisted upon it by some Western churches enthralled to their culture, and to return to the truly Catholic idea as set out at the 1920 Lambeth Conference, which speaks certainly of the independence of Christian freedom, but it also says that this must recognize the restraints of truth and of love. So in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. That is the ancient principle which must guide us in the choppy waters of relativism and revisionism. The churches together must decide through their authentic teachers what the church has always, everywhere, and by all, semper ubique et ab omnibus, believed that the Bible teaches, and what questions touch the life of all, so they must be decided by all. An ancient canonical principle, quod omnes tangit, ab omnibus approbatur. Both GAFCON and the Global South movements for orthodoxy in the Anglican Communion are struggling to have these fundamental principles recognized if there is to be genuine fellowship in the gospel for the future. The World Council of Churches has also had a program on the gospel and culture directed by the Indian theologian Christopher Durai Singh. This culminated in a conference on mission and evangelism in Salvador, Brazil. Rather than emphasizing limits on inculturation and contextualization, the program sought rather to identify criteria for the authentic transmission and living out of the radical demands of the gospel in various cultures. We should ask, therefore, if the mind of Christ or of the scriptures is being conveyed in the context of a particular culture, both in terms of affirming what is true and life-enhancing, and of challenging anything that denies the humanity and its flourishing, especially of oppressed and marginalized groups. Is the gospel being made more intelligible by the process? Is it able to touch the heart and to inspire the people of a particular culture? Does it inform the process of change which is required for social and spiritual transformation? On the one hand, the process seeks to convey the whole of Christ's mind as it has been revealed to the church. On the other, it recognizes that there are important trajectories in the Bible of providence, liberation, and spirituality, which may appeal to those of specific cultures. Although the emphases are different in the two approaches, one emphasizes congruence with the nature of the gospel itself and the need for unity among God's people, whilst the other lays stress on the liberating power of the gospel. Both exclude certain forms of enculturation as compromising the nature of the gospel. Richard Niebuhr, in his seminal and still important work, Christ and Culture, attempted to show the different ways in which the gospel can relate to particular cultures. Thus, there is the Christ of or for culture, where the gospel informs the beliefs, values, customs, and laws of a culture. It also provides a means of critique if the culture strays too far from such beliefs and values. So Western Christendom, Byzantium, Armenia, and Ethiopia may be taken as examples or where there was an explicit acknowledgement of what the culture owed to the Christian tradition, however much it may have strayed from its foundational principles. Christ is also above every culture, according to Niebuhr, and in the sense that no culture can fully express all the riches of the gospel. Personal faith, the sacraments of the church, a rich interior life, are needed if we are to access all that Christ has to offer. It is true, according to him, that the gospel does not leave any culture that it encounters as it is, but brings about a profound transformation which allows what is best and most creative in a culture to be expressed. According to Niebuhr, however, there have been and always will be occasions when the gospel will be against culture, when, for instance, it denies the reality of providence or purpose or the equal value of every human person. In the name of the good news, then, Christians will have to oppose all that is God and life denying. Now, we saw earlier how the late Archbishop David Gitari of Kenya was a stalwart upholder of the need for inculturation. But in the very address that we looked at earlier, when we were considering his work, he recognizes those inescapable situations where Christians and churches, in the name of the gospel, must challenge cultural assumptions and practices which are contrary to God's providence in creation, to the moral law embedded in our consciences and elaborated in the Bible, and to the plain teaching of Christ. In a church which is both global and increasingly at home in many different cultures, the proposers and practitioners of inculturation will have to be very attentive to the dangers of presenting the good news of salvation only partially because of scruples about the culture, or because Christianity is seen as too difficult, or because a culture is instinctively syncretistic, seeking to assimilate rather than to oppose. They may also have to resist the temptation of easy pickings by not laying out clearly the demands of the gospel, as well as the grace that accompanies them for those who profess faith in Christ and his work for us. The Jesuit Roberto de Nobili experimented boldly in creating an Indian rite, which took full account of Indian customs and was oriented to reaching the upper castes. While there was toleration, even approval from Rome regarding the adoption of Indian dress, food, and language, Nobili's desire to allow upper caste Indians to be segregated from lower caste Christians was much more controversial. Although some of his converts survived, he was withdrawn from the mission, and in fact, it was only when the lower castes began coming to faith that something like a mass movement began. While Nobili's sacrificial work cannot be minimized, in the end, the sensus fidelium has been that neither caste nor race can be the basis for a local church, even if people from a similar family, professional, or cultural background can gather for fellowship, study, and prayer in ways similar to the churches in people's homes that are mentioned in the New Testament, but which are distinct from the larger gatherings in towns and cities to which many of the letters of the New Testament are addressed, given, of course, that these wider gatherings may also have taken place in people's homes. What Nobili was doing in India was also being done in China. His fellow Jesuit and near contemporary Matteo Ricci adopted Chinese vocabulary to convey the Christian message. He used Chinese for worship and held that honors paid to Confucius and the ancestors were merely civil honors and should not be confused with pagan worship. At first, this proved acceptable to the Chinese and was approved by Rome. In the end, however, Rome judged Ricci and his successors also to have compromised, and the concessions were rescinded. One of the reasons for the eventual suppression of the Jesuit order in the 18th century had to do with their approach to contextualization. From our point of view, we can see that much of what the Jesuits were doing was authentic enculturation, opposed by the Roman Curia's monocultural approach. On the other hand, there were certainly features of their work which could legitimately be criticized for syncretism and compromise. More recently, there have been missiologies which have argued that people become Christians more easily within their social, ethnic, or even professional grouping, the so-called homogeneous unit principle. In one sense, this is not controversial. We have missions to students, sports people, housing estates, and language groups. We have seen also how such groups, when they've been reached, can express their faith and their worship alongside others from a similar background, on analogy with the New Testament churches of the household, which show a family likeness, although the household would not have been anything, of course, like the contemporary nuclear family, but would have included extended relatives, servants, and slaves. Such an understanding of church can be valid as long as it is not the only way of belonging and of being church. The New Testament speaks also of a wider belonging, for example, to the church of a town or city, which is characterized not by likeness, but by unlikeness in terms of wealth or poverty, racial or religious background. See, for instance, 1 Corinthians 11, Galatians 2, and James 2. The New Testament also knows of the church in a particular region, such as Judea or Asia, presumably even more diverse than the church of a city or a town. There is then the worldwide church, as in Ephesians and Colossians. Each such manifestation of the church, if it is faithful to the deposit of faith, partakes in that heavenly reality, the blessed company of all the faithful, or what Paul calls Jerusalem, our mother, which is above, Galatians 4. So each church is authentically church to the extent that Christ is present in it. Those then who would like to worship and have fellowship with others like them must be committed to worship and have fellowship with those who are unlike them in ethnicity, caste, class, and even language. In Africa, for example, there is a tendency to have single tribe dioceses. If a tribe is the only one in a particular area, there can, of course, be no objection to such an arrangement. But what, as is often the case, there are others. Do they then ask for their own diocese or even province? A tribe should be able to express Christian faith and to worship in its own way and language, but at the same time, it must show itself as committed to the Catholicity of the Church by a wider belonging. For example, in a multi-tribe diocese, by accepting episcopal and local church leadership from others, and by regular worship and fellowship with Christians unlike themselves. In the past, Christians have had to reject certain cultural practices in the name of the gospel. The practice of sati, where usually higher caste Hindu widows threw themselves on the funeral pyres of their husbands, was vigorously opposed by Christian missionaries, whose struggle also inspired Hindu reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and led the British to ban the practice in 1829. Twin killing, similarly, in East Africa was opposed until quite recent times by missionaries, both African and others, as they sought to bring the gospel to those groups which practiced it. This was also the case with cattle stealing among the Maasai, on the grounds that all cattle belonged to them anyway, and so to take other people's cattle was not really stealing. The question of polygamy has been much more controversial. Western missionaries in Africa, for instance, prohibited polygamous men from baptism unless they had put away all but one of their wives. This meant that those who were baptized had to send away their other wives, possibly into penury or even prostitution. Some who had considered the Christian faith found this demand impossible and either remained in their traditional religion or responded to Islamic dawah and became Muslims. David Guittari treats polygamy as a matter which the gospel can tolerate for the time being. Thus, in the Anglican Church in Kenya, polygamists can be baptized and confirmed together with their wives and children. The expectation is that those already Christian will not take any more wives. If they do, they will be disciplined, but pastoral care will still be available to them. Under Guittari's influence, although with opposition from some Anglican provinces in Africa, the 1988 Lambeth Conference passed a resolution which more or less reflected Guittari's position, whilst not endorsing his claim that the Bible does not clearly teach monogamy as God's purpose for men and women. In some cultures, even among Christians, arranged marriages are the norm. There is nothing wrong in the practice itself, and it has been shown to produce stable marriages with a greater involvement of families than in marriages built on a chance meeting or on mere romantic feeling, or nowadays, of course, meeting on the internet. There must, however, be the free consent which the Church has always insisted on, and couples should not be pressurized into marriage because of other agendas the families may have. I may have told you the story of when I was taking a wedding when I was Bishop of Raiwind in Pakistan. And, when the officiant asks the couples various questions, so, do you take this person to be your lawful wedded husband and so on? So whenever it came to the girl's turn, her mother would reply from the back, yes, she does, she would say. So I had to stop the ceremony, and I said, she has to answer, otherwise we can't go on with this. In some of these situations, the family links are so strong that the couples find it difficult to leave and to cleave. This is one of the problems in some cultures, in Asia particularly. So couples find it difficult to leave and to cleave and to become one flesh in the sacramental sense laid out in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and ultimately based, of course, on the creation mandate itself in Genesis. So they continue to be in solidarity with their original family units rather than the creation of a new unit. In the Western world today, it is most important to state and to restate a properly biblical anthropology. God has made men and women together in his image. Together, they've been given a common mission in the world, which divides into the mandate for procreation and family life and the wider mandate of stewardship and creation, both, of course, very important in the Western world today. Although a couple work in partnership and in mutual assistance, they each fulfill their role in distinctive ways which arise out of the way in which each has been made. Their complementarity, biological, sexual, psychological, and social, is the basis of marriage and of wider relationships in church and society, where each functions in the integrity of his or her own being. This does not mean that roles are stereotyped, although that may happen in fallen cultures, but that each fulfills his or her tasks, whatever they may be, in ways that are distinctive and different, and for us to celebrate such distinction and such difference. The constructivism so fashionable in the West, where people construct their own personal, gendered, sexual, and social worlds, regardless of the objectivity of their own beings and of the world, is decisively judged by such an anthropology. Even if pastorally we may be called to exercise compassion for those confused about themselves or others, or by the culture around them, which encourages people to relativize everything from sexual preference to the sanctity of the person at every stage of life. We've seen then that inculturation or contextualization cannot be an unprincipled endorsement of every custom, value, or belief of a particular culture. It must proceed with certain criteria which spring from the gospel itself, and it must work within certain limits, which again have to do with the nature of the gospel, of the Christian community, and with the necessity of maintaining fellowship amongst the different communities set within very diverse cultures. From time to time, the evangelist and the pastor will, for the sake of the gospel, have to say no to aspects of cultures. This, of course, alerts us to the prophetic ministry of the church, both for Christians themselves and for wider society. Such a ministry should always be exercised in love, but it may need to critique the political and social life of a community in which the church finds itself, the institutional arrangements of the church itself, and even from time to time, the values and lifestyles of Christians. But that is for the next lecture. Thank you very much indeed, Tom, wherever you are.
I'm here. Thank you, Michael. Let me just announce to everyone joining, we want to hear your feedback and questions, and we will receive those as we come. The most easiest way to do that is on the bottom of your screen. There's a little button that says reactions. And on reactions, there's a little section that says raise hand. And so when I see your hand, I will call upon you, because I can't really see all 40 of you without flipping back and forth between screens. So when you want to have a question for Bishop Michael, that's the best way to get my attention, and then I will acknowledge you, and then you can unmute your microphone and ask that question. But to start it off, Michael, thank you very much for an excellent lecture. This is a question in terms of my own research of looking at this whole area of enculturation, but there seems to be a unique area when we come into a culture in light of the powers and principalities that are in place within that culture. My own work, and I will be presenting a lecture on this in a couple of weeks, is in terms of the changing dynamics of the political ideology of China and the kind of shaping that's going on, and the requirements that are coming to the church in light of that. And among those are that you must move the premier of China up to an equal or even higher level than your belief in Jesus and God, which, and what's interesting is they're actually drawing from aspects of writers from Nazi ideology. And we see this aspect, especially within Protestantism, where Christ does not transform culture, but culture seems to transform Christ in the church so that we become not the witness we may need to be. So anyway, just your thoughts on that would be interesting in terms of how far does enculturation go in terms of embracing the political ideological structure of the communities we're moving into?
Well, I mean, this is, of course, a very old question. That's why I mentioned the imperial cult. I mean, Domitian's claim that he was Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. I mean, this is what the early Christians had to say no to in the end.
Mm-hmm.
That yes, they were obedient to the emperor. They would obey the laws of the empire, but they would not burn incense to the emperor. You know, this was often the only thing the magistrates required of the early Christians, was just burn a pinch of incense to the image of the emperor and you could go home. And if you didn't do that, then you went to the wild beasts or to the arena or whatever for execution. And this question has risen again and again in the story of the church, where Christians have had to refuse the pretensions of worldly rulers. So I think there's a sort of rule of thumb here, isn't there, that we, in the light of Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, we must obey the authorities that are set above us, over us, except when they prohibit us to do what God commands, or alternatively, command us to do what God prohibits.
Good.
Then we have to say no to them. And Christians continue to do that, have always done this. I mean, you mentioned Germany, the very costly witness of the confessing church, which has given rise to a whole new way of doing theology, apart from anything else, is a very good example. In this country, the opposition of people like George Bell to the decision to carpet bomb certain German cities in revenge for the Blitz and so on. I mean, that's another example, perhaps not as costly, but it did cost George Bell something to take that stand. Wherever Christian worship is forbidden, in some Islamic countries, for instance, Christians continue to worship because they know that that is a higher calling than what the state is telling them to do. I think with China, we will see it's not just this process of Sinicization or whatever they call it, but of a cult that is developing around a figure. I mean, as you know better than I do, that the Chinese Christians have been through this before with Mao Zedong. And it may be that this kind of cult worship of a particular figure is something to which Chinese culture is vulnerable. It's not alone in that, of course. But I think the kind of reformed stance that has been taken with setting out the limits to the state's authorities is exactly the right thing to have done. The Vatican has tried to compromise with Beijing on this, and they're now finding that having given some ground, Beijing wants more and more.
Yes, that has been happening. I'm opening this up. I'm waiting for hands. TV, Thomas, you've unmuted. Do you want to ask a question, TV?
Bishop Michael, what's the role of public prophetic role of the church as it relates to inculturation?
The prophetic role of the church, yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the church has to give attention to culture. I mean, there's no question about it. It has always done so. For example, in terms of language or styles of worship. So my concern, when I was Bishop of Raiwind in Pakistan, Raiwind is right on the Indian border. The Indian border is just across there. And my concern was here we were contextualizing worship, music, preaching in terms of an Islamic culture, predominantly Islamic culture. Raiwind is the center for the Islamic missionary movement, the Tablighi Jamaat. And then across the border, here were my Indian brothers and sisters also busily contextualizing in the context of a dominant Hindu culture.
Hindu culture.
Yeah. So when would we reach a position where we were mutually incomprehensible to each other, Christians, I mean? That was the question. And I think that is the controlling question, that on the one hand, inculturation has its limits. So making Christianity Chinese, going back to the previous question, well, of course, there are many ways in which that can be done and has been done since the time of the Nestorian church there. But there comes a time when you have to say no. So some people in the context of inculturation were saying that it is possible for Christians to attend the prayers at the mosque. And they did so. Now, I would draw a line there and say, no, it is not possible. It is, of course, possible to observe what other people are doing as guests and so on, and be respectful. But Christians cannot, in conscience, join in the Islamic Salat, or, to take another example, the Hindu Puja. That is, that is where you need to stop. On the prophetic side, well, let me give you an example. I mean, when the process of Islamization was taking place in Pakistan, the government asked us as Christian leaders to say what we thought of the introduction of Islamic penal law, Sharia penal law. And our response to them, which I had to write, I mean, I was the youngest person around, and I was persuaded to write it. Let's put it like that. But the response was from everyone. What we had to say was that, of course, Christians believe that the state has the responsibility to punish wrongdoers, but this has to be within certain limits. It cannot violate people's inherent dignity. It cannot mutilate so that reform becomes impossible. It cannot inflict certain punishments that would make it impossible for people to be rehabilitated back into society. For instance, if you cut off somebody's hand for theft, how then do you equip them to earn their living later on? So those are the kinds of crunch points where you have to take a stand.
Okay, we've got a question here. Let me just read it. Question is, what do you think should be the stance of the church towards women's rights in the enculturation work, where some cultures put women in a lower status than men?
Well, first of all, of course, there is the biblical witness that men and women have been created in God's image and created together in God's image. They have been given a common task, which I mentioned, or common tasks, which they fulfill each in their own way. I mean, the Bible both upholds equality and difference. I mean, women are not men and men are not women. You may have heard my story about the South African Archbishop who was a single man and quite a shy man. And he was asked to speak to the Mothers' Union. Well, I mean, those who know Africa will know what the Mothers' Union is like in Africa. He was quite sort of nervous about this. And to set himself at ease and also the women, he said, ladies, I would like you to know that underneath this cassock that I'm wearing, you and I are exactly the same. Well, this is, of course, this is not true. I mean, women are different, men are different from women, women are different from men, and they fulfill their tasks, their common tasks, in different ways, and those should be celebrated and received on every side. So I think that's the kind of thing. I mean, once again, in Pakistan, when the process of Islamization was being promoted, this was leading to a restriction on opportunities for women for education and employment. And we supported the Women's Action Forum, which was formed at that time, mainly of Muslim women, and did what we could for them. I remember when I was at the cathedral in Lahore, which was opposite the High Court, the women were demonstrating outside the court because of some judgment that was coming, and the police lathi charged them. You know what a lathi is? It's a stick with a steel tip. And so we opened the cathedral gates, the women came in, we shut the gates, and the police were left outside. Well, that didn't please the authorities, but certainly we were able to act in a small way in solidarity with these women at that time. Yeah, so it depends on what the situation is. I mean, in what became later on British India, not only the ban on sati, but universal education for females, the introduction of health for healthcare for women and children and so on, really came at the behest of the Christian Church and of Christian mission, and many Hindu reformers from Raja Ram Mohan Roy to Mahatma Gandhi acknowledged this and saw it as an encouragement for the reform of Hinduism itself. I don't know if people know the very fine book by M.M. Thomas called The Acknowledged Christ of the Indian Renaissance, but I mean that tells the story very well.
Brother Al, unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
It might be, thank you, Bishop Michael, for a very interesting lecture yet again. And it might be interesting, I thought, for you to know that before coming to you, we were in a session, the bishops of the Iglesia Anglicana de Chile. And we were talking about just this. How do we enculturate in the present day Chile? We have Mapuche Anglicans that have a completely different cultural style to the ones where we work among the upper middle classes. And part of our discussion was about enculturation. Of course, Acts 17:23 comes up again and again. Paul says, I see you're very religious people, but I'm now going to tell you how to know. You don't know the unknown God. We were asking, how can liturgy help people not just know about God, but how we get them to know God? And my studies in Pentecostalism among the Mapuche people especially show that, yes, as they get to know the power and the presence of the living Holy Spirit, then the content of biblical teaching, even in liturgy, gets through. So Paul seemed to be very, very confident that somehow, if the Athenians, steeped in all the Greek mythology, got to know God by the Holy Spirit, then they would come through, and he does this again and again. If you read Gordon Fee on what to him is presence, power of the Spirit. So my question is, how have you noticed liturgy helps in the enculturation, or does the opposite in the enculturation process?
Well, I think the first thing, thank you, Bishop. The first thing is that human beings are homo adorans. They are built for worship. We are actually made for worship. And there is an aspiration to worship. The question is how we should do it. Now, I think myself that the fundamental documents of Anglicanism allow people to worship in ways that are best suited to them. They are a charter, therefore, for inculturation, which we ourselves have not used enough, I think. So we need to do that. But yeah, I mean, just to take examples, take Nigeria as an example. I mean, I remember Anglicanism in Nigeria, very prayer book and very English, only less than 50 years ago, 40 years ago. But now it has changed to quite a degree because of the influence of Pentecostalism. And so, yeah, there are still some features of that Englishness there, but when it comes to the offertory, there are 5 offertories in the Nigerian church at least. And each is done with dancing and clapping and singing. And you say, well, yes, this is here. These people are now really expressing their beliefs and their feelings and their faith. So I don't know what it is that the Mapuche, what will release them for worship. There must be a key that does that. In many cultures, the Psalms, a proper translation and setting to music of the Psalms has proved to be the key to do this. The sacraments themselves are a key. I mean, Western cultures are generally desacralized cultures. They don't appreciate the sacramental nature of the material. But many traditional cultures are inherently sacramental. I used to say in Pakistan that even the Plymouth Brethren in Pakistan believe in the real presence at the Eucharist, in their breaking of the bread. There's nobody thinks that Christ isn't really there. So those are the things that make worship lively.
Good. Brother Amir, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Bishop Michael, thank you very much for your excellent lecture today. My question is, in terms of dialogue with Muslim, particularly with Sunni, about the essence of God in Islam and Christianity, which is different, I think. How or what kind of dialogue can we develop with Muslim in terms of essence of God? Or basically, what is being used commonly to start this discourse with them? For instance, as you know, triune God based on relationality and Allah is based on singularity. How we can develop such a dialogue with them? Thank you.
I mean, this is why I mentioned this fact about the numerical nature of the oneness of God in the Quran and Islamic tradition generally. There are other features about God in the Quran that are not so clear. I think this also has to be said. For instance, what is the status of God's word and God's spirit in the Quran? The traditional interpretation that the spirit is the Archangel Gabriel is not actually mentioned in the Quran. So who is the spirit? It says, for instance, in Surah Bani Israel, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنَ الرُّوحِ قُلْ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. If they ask you concerning the spirit, say the spirit is from the command of, or the word of my Lord. So here you have word and spirit and the one whose word and spirit they are. It is true that the Johar, or the essence of God, is unknown, or is supposed to be unknown in Islam. And to some extent also for Christians, we cannot wholly know God because he is beyond our capacity to know him completely, but it is by God's revelation that we know to some extent who he is. And that revelation is of God as Father, as his Word or his Son, and as his Spirit. So Word and Spirit, God's Word and Spirit are not only about the work that God is doing in creation, but they show us something of who God is. And they bring in this question of relationality. I think people, Muslims, do want to have a relationship with God when they plead for mercy, when they ask for forgiveness. These are questions even when they talk of love. This is one of the remarkable things that we were noticing in our lectures on Sufism and Christian mysticism. One of the remarkable things is how love came to be such a dominant theme in Sufism. And it came to be that because people want to love God. And how do they know that God loves them? Those are the sorts of subjects that open the doors for talking about God in this way with them, that if he is to be truly one who loves and is loved, then there must be some relationality possible with God.
Good. Let's go to Marina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bishop, for your presentation. My question is less on a political level, but for dialogue and encounter between people who are discussing religion. I'm sure you're aware of the document Christian Witness in a Multi-Religious World, which was signed in 2011 by WCC, World Evangelical Alliance, and the Vatican. And it says, any comment on or critical approach should be made in the spirit of mutual respect, making sure not to bear false witness concerning other religions. So if we accept this as a rule to be observed in dialogue, how would this relate to the critical issues you mentioned, like polygamy or other cultural values, and in a way not be considered as disrespectful? Do you think this would work in a context such as Pakistan?
Yes, well, take the question about polygamy. When Muslim women come to Christian weddings, one of the things that strikes them most forcibly is the permanence of the marriage until death us do part, because for them, they have no such assurance of the permanence of marriage. At any time, a marriage can be ended with divorce. So often they will say, "You really mean that this is for life and this is for good and so on?" And you say, "Yes, that is the teaching of Jesus," or whatever. So it can be done without antagonizing anybody or saying anything against anyone. The question about freedom of belief, for instance, in our dialogue with Al-Azhar, we had a discipline that each side could only raise one issue at every dialogue. So the Muslims would raise the question about the Paris cartoons or whatever it was that was worrying them at the time. And we could raise questions, and sometimes those questions were about religious freedom. And to ask from within the Islamic tradition itself what need there was to deny religious freedom to people. And sometimes it had a good result. I remember at the end of one such dialogue, the then Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Tantawi, and I did a joint lecture in Cairo. What I said was not important at all, but what he said at the lecture in Cairo, that what Egyptians believed was not a matter for the state at all. Now, in the Egyptian context, this was a huge departure. So, yeah, and this was all done with the greatest of respect and the greatest of friendship. In Iran, we have been able to raise very difficult questions about freedom of belief with the ulama in Iran. And this is not to say that they agree with us, but the questions are asked and sometimes are answered. So I think respect does not mean agreement. I mean, otherwise we'd all be of the same religion. The reason that we are of different faiths is because we disagree about some quite basic matters. And this can also be true. I mean, the Muslims are asking very difficult questions about liberal Protestantism and its moral and ethical basis. And we have to listen to that also.
Good. Let's go to Brother Sam. Go ahead.
Thank you, Bishop. As always, pleasure to hear you. My question is inculturation in the context of migration. When Global South comes to North, they tend to recreate, the church the culture that they left behind.
Yeah.
And even as over decades and over generation, they try to adapt, and then subsequent generations become much more westernized. And so there is a reverse reverse mission or reverse enculturation happening. And what is its impact on the host nations, which welcomes large number of immigrants from the Global South?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think there is danger and opportunity. So the danger is that people will become ghettoized, that they will worship. I mean, this is true, for instance, of the Afro-Caribbean churches in Britain. They're very large, some of them, and they're very effective, some of them, but they are largely addressing their own people. They have not seen generally speaking, the opportunity for mission to the wider society. Whether the next generation, which is much more integrated, of course, does so, remains to be seen so far. And people may belong to two different cultures. I mean, that is also possible. But there is opportunity here also. I remember being invited to a Chinese New Year service by the Chinese Christian Fellowship here locally in Kent. And when I went, they had invited all the sort of Kent establishment, the mayors and the police officers and all these people. And the place was full. It was in a Methodist church, they had it. And the establishment, which might generally have been hostile to Christianity or to Christian claims, actually listened very respectfully to what these Chinese Christians were saying, because they were Chinese. They would not have given a hearing otherwise, to the extent that they did. So I think there is that opportunity. I know that some Pakistani Christians also in the north of Britain make it a point to have a big Christmas celebration to which they invite local people and see it as a way of witnessing. The question about how to belong, I mean, I think the answer lies in some kind of dual belonging, that you both belong to the local church, however you understand that, and to some kind of cultural expression of your faith. Now, if the local church is wise, they will make room for that. I don't see why not. And both sides can be enriched. Some people are doing that. I wish that more would do it. There is resistance on both sides to some extent to do it, but we need to encourage them. I mean, migration is now a fact of life. And not just a fact of life, but a fact of providence, I think, in the evangelization of the world, as you know better than I do. But just two stories. One was that there is a very fine Catholic church in one of the northern towns, which the Catholic Church in this country was closing down. It has now been taken over by the Syro-Malabar Catholics, who have turned it into the cathedral of their epoch, who is now one of the big Catholic bishops in this country. Now, this could never have been foreseen, even 25 years ago. But there is now enough of a Syro-Malabar community to make that possible. The other story, that I was on a plane, I was going to Rome for an ecumenical meeting, and I sat in a group, as it happened, of a whole number of ladies, mainly going for pilgrimage, Catholic ladies going for pilgrimage to Rome. And they said to me, "Oh, Father, we are so worried about the church near us and the convent near us, and it is being taken over by some American Christian." I mean, they were horrified by this. Eventually, it is actually been taken over by an Indian Christian community. And it's flourishing. It's absolutely flourishing. A coastal town in Kent, ordinary coastal. So these things are happening everywhere around us, and we need to have ears to hear and eyes to see.
Good. We'll turn to David. Go ahead, David.
Yes, thank you, Bishop Michael, for your lecture. You mentioned the concept of fulfillment of cultures, and I got reminded of Miroslav Volf and his notion of washing the face of Jesus in any culture where Jesus is actually already present. Would you please expand on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, Jesus.
Oops, sorry. Unmute, Michael. You somehow you got muted. So unmute. There you go.
Don't know how that happened.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So in the sense that God's eternal word is present in every culture and is working in every culture, then of course, in that sense, Jesus as the embodiment of that word is present in that culture. And we have to discover how that presence is shown. I mean, the early apologists, as you know, saw this work of the Logos Pammatikos and not only as pointing to Christ, but as critiquing the present religious and other cultural practices of their listeners. I mean, so we have to set that universality of the eternal word incarnate in Christ against the historical particularity of Jesus. I mean, we can't lose either of those. Otherwise, Christ just becomes an idea, just becomes kind of disembodied logos or whatever the equivalent might be in a particular culture, and we would lose Christianity's historical bearings with the incarnation in a particular culture at a particular time, and so on. But the significance is there, and one of the ways to approach it, I wrote an article about this a long time ago, which is, how is the Christic question asked in every culture? How is it asked? And for instance, in the Indian philosophical tradition, the Christic question is the question about how the absolute unity relates to the created world. What's the intermediary that brings about the created world? I think that's the Christic question in the Indian philosophical tradition. And when that is answered in terms of the Logos and the Logos incarnate, then that can make Jesus Christ relevant to those people who are that way minded. In Islam, for instance, we were talking about the acknowledged Christ of the Indian Renaissance. but there's also the acknowledged Christ of Islam. I mean, what are the ramifications of everything that the Quran says about Jesus? They are still being worked out. There are still so many aspects to it. Why did the Sufis regard Jesus as the ideal ascetic and mystic? Why is he celebrated in poetry as the one who heals? So in every culture, I think, how is the Christic question asked and how is it answered can be a very important preparatio evangelica, as I was saying, preparation for the sharing of the gospel with those cultures. The question has been asked and also answered about how Jesus Christ should be portrayed. I mean, should he always be portrayed as a Middle Eastern Palestinian Jew, which he was or is? He is, because he's still got that thing about him. The incarnation has not come to an end. Or should he be portrayed as Japanese or African or whatever, or Indian, as the case may be? I think there is a case. I think there is a case for emphasizing the history, but also a case for people owning Christ in their own culture. And so the portrayal of Christ in a particular cultural form says he is for everyone. Christ is for everyone. And so, yeah, I think it is perfectly right that if Christ can be expressed in terms of Middle European medieval images, why should he not be expressed in terms of African or Indian or Middle Eastern forms?
John, thank you for your patience. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. The support for Trump amongst American evangelicals is a concern, certainly of European Christians. I just wonder how far you relate, and that seems a very bad case of enculturation of captivity to a culture from outside. I wonder how you relate to that from a worldwide evangelical perspective.
The question of Trump, you mean? Oh, yeah. Donald Trump, yes.
Evangelical support for him.
Yeah. Well, of course, American evangelicals are very divided about that themselves. And Christianity Today, what it said about him just before the election. I mean, at the risk of sounding sort of naive, Trump is no worse than many, or was no worse than many other rulers in the world today, where Christians have to find a way of living with them. I mean, we have a situation here in Britain that I find quite remarkable. I mean, Boris Johnson was our prime minister. I know him to some extent, and I know what he believes, and I'm quite astonished that he should be where he is, but he is, and we have to deal with him. The cult that is emerging in China has already been mentioned by Tom. We have Narendra Modi in India. I never thought that I would think that Imran Khan was a better leader than anything that India could produce, but I now do think so. I mean, a good cricketer, but that's another matter. So, I mean, again, I would say that it's those limits that we are to obey our rulers unless they cross that line, which I laid out. And that line can sometimes not be as remote as people think. So When I was setting up a particular charity, the Charity Commission said, are you going to campaign for laws to be changed? And I said, yes. I mean, for instance, we may campaign for the blasphemy laws to be repealed, or the apostasy law in Sudan or Mauritania or wherever. So they said, well, if that's the case, you can't be registered as a charity because that's a political activity. So I said, do you really mean that? And they said, yes. I said, well, if you do, then I will take you for judicial review. And they said, do you really mean that? And I said, yes, I do really mean that. So they said, well, we'll register you as a charity. So, you have to be, I mean, these questions arise in different forms with different people. Now, the reason Trump was thrown up, as it were, if that's the right word, by the American electorate, was there was a deep feeling of unease that America was losing the plot vis-a-vis countries like China. It was at a disadvantage in all sorts of ways in competition and so on. And I think those questions that have been raised, perhaps they were badly raised, but they will continue to be questions for the new administration. They're not going away. The question of immigration, I mean, America is founded on immigration in a way that Britain is not. And it is a question that will not go away because of its physical, geographical location, its attraction for so many people, even if they don't have a very nice life there, once they get there. But as with Britain, I would argue for a principled policy on immigration that is obviously no country, not even the United States, can take an unlimited number of people. So there has to be some fair criteria for immigration, for refugees, for economic migrants, and so on, which reassures the present population of the United States, but also is fair towards those who want to come there. I mean, I would say the same thing about Britain. One of the problems about Britain's immigration policy, compared even to America, is that the immigration policy of Britain is particularly founded on wealth. So the more you have, the easier your chance of coming and staying here. Now, this is completely immoral. Whereas I think American policy tends to be much more about need because of its history, and needs to stay that way, given that the country has limited resources. I think there are some other issues, for instance, that concern Christians. The question about the beginnings and the end of life, those sorts of legislations, liberalization of the drugs laws, the question about the nature of the family, those sorts of things. Whoever is in the administration, American Christians of all kinds, Catholics, evangelicals, Orthodox, will continue to raise those issues.
Good. Well, thank you, Michael. And with that, we will bring our questions to a close.